Hi, everyone. Welcome back. This is our third web conference, our second with live participants this time. So let's start our session the way we always do. First, you want to go through and check everything. You want to set up your camera and microphone. You want to make sure that you have our chat sessions opened, ready to go. You want to go through, make sure that you verify that your audio is working and that your video is working. We will be using audio as we do most classes, so just make sure that's working. And go ahead and prepare your space for learning. Don't just put your phone on vibrate. Make sure you silence them, shut your door. Make sure there's no distractions going on in your room. That means making sure my Chihuahua Papillon is out of the room and locked up in a different room so you don't hear her barking. Whatever your process is, make sure you get that all set up. All right, let's go into our quality check. So if you see that everything's recording up in the left-hand corner, great. If you can see quality check, great. And if you can hear me, go ahead and raise your hand. I will tell you right now, I've had a lot of technical issues today, so if you notice something, say something. All right? Thank you all. And for virtual listeners, if you notice any problems, email me immediately so that I can fix the issue. All right, just real quick, let's go over session notes again. I want live listeners and virtual listeners to take session notes. Now, I want you to use whatever method works best for you. I tend to use stream of consciousness when I do notes. You may want to listen to the whole thing and then do your notes afterwards. There's no right or wrong way to do it. Whatever method works for you is the one I want you to use. Just be sure to include the main point. Include your own thoughts as we're going through things, any questions you have, whether you are live or a virtual listener. And then, of course, virtual listeners, you need to include activities as directed, and there are even some for the live listeners that you'll need to include. All right? So let's get started. The learning objectives for this session are to summarize the idea of community of inquiry, evaluate the ways that metacognition is used or not used, design ways to integrate metacognitive activities into the learning environment, and reflect on experiences with metacognitive activities, ways to create collaborative metacognitive activities, and professional perspectives on metacognition. So let's start with community of inquiry. When you hear this term, what does it make you think? Which word do you tend to focus on? I know I tend to focus on inquiry, and then I think about community. So if you think about community of inquiry, what one word comes to mind when you hear this term? Live participants, if you could post a one-word response in the chat box. Virtual participants, write your response in your notes. All right, so the responses from our live listeners, Candace says questions, Katie says discussions, and Melinda says group. Great responses. For me, the first thing that pops to mind is collaboration. But again, there's no right or wrong answer to this question. It's simply, what does it make you think of when you hear that term? Because we all bring our own different perspectives to this, so we're going to think something differently when we hear it. So metacognition is a really important part of learning, and it's particularly important when we're talking about a community of inquiry. Now, in the past, metacognition was typically thought of as an individual, solitary kind of activity. But with a community of inquiry, we're trying to move this into a more collaborative group kind of activity. So what are your experiences with metacognition? Is it typically a part of a training or a learning experience that you've had? My live participants, could you go ahead and give me a thumbs up if it has been, or a thumbs down if it hasn't? And virtual participants, could you write your response in your session notes? Candace says yes and no. Katie says yes. Melinda says yes. You know, I have a similar experience, Candace. I know in many of my educational classes, I've had metacognition as part of that, but some trainings I've had don't, and not all higher ed classes I've had have that as part of it. So thank you all for your responses. So moving metacognitive practices from individual to group practice really puts an emphasis on those higher skills and the importance of collaboration in learning. So it's not this solitary act. Every part of the learning process is collaborative in some way. So now we're going to move on to a case study. I made this pretty broad because I want you to consider this from your own perspectives, your own professional stances, your own disciplines. You have been asked to adapt a standard training or learning module based on, how it's termed to you, current learning models. Depending on your profession or discipline, design an activity that encourages metacognitive practices for a community of inquiry and why metacognition is an important part of the learning. So for live participants, you're going to head to a breakout room, and I'm going to share the Google slide with you in the chat box so that you have access to that. Virtual participants, you're also going to write your response in the Google slide, although you'll see it's labeled with virtual participants for your slide, and you'll be able to access that in the chat. So give me just a second here. All right. The Google Slide link is in the chat box, and then I'm going to move you into breakout groups here in just a moment. And you're going to have 3 minutes to discuss and then be ready to report back to the rest of the class. All right. All right, it looks like everyone made it back. So give me just a second here and we'll take a look at what you came up with. All right, who would like to share?
I will.
Great.
Okay, so we did talk a little bit about some of our different fields and disciplines, and some of the systems and technology we discussed included the case study. So basically the same thing we just came from, doing collective and collaborative problem solving with the classes, and pre-selected groups. So you're not picking the same groups over and over. You don't have a lot of that confirmation bias that you might experience if you were in the same peer groups over and over. We also mentioned asking the students to write reflections after discussions to describe different views that they have encountered in the scenario. And then our last idea we added on is using the beyond bullet point design to focus on big ideas, key concepts, and then avoid that cognitive overload.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you all for sharing that. I completely agree. There are a lot of really interesting ways that we can build metacognition into our classes and into that community of inquiry. Give me just a second here. And I'm going to bring us back to our slides here in just a second. All right. So again, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And virtual participants, please make sure you write up your own thoughts after having shared in the Google Slides and hearing from your peers what your thoughts are. Just expand on it a little bit for me. All right. Okay, and before we end the session, I want to go over the writing prompt that I want you to include in your session notes, and this is for live and virtual participants both. You've had a chance to hear about different perspectives on metacognition. You've heard from each other on various approaches to including metacognitive activities into the classroom or into your training. So now I want to hear a little bit more of your own thoughts on the concept after listening and discussing this idea of metacognition, and really apply it to your own field or your own discipline. And again, include that in your session notes at the end of this session. All right, so coming up, you're going to complete that writing prompt and submit it in your session notes and continue reading the text, and I'm going to see you all again here in a week. Thank you.